Thank you very much for this invitation in this amazing setting. My task is to give you some insights about the Calumny by Sandro Botticelli. This is a painting exhibited in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. A brief summary of my topic. Firstly, I'll give you some information about the painting. Secondly, the iconographic description, the famous unfair trial that is in the Calumny. This is the big painting. This is a small painting, 25 by 35 inches, but it's very interesting. And thirdly, my interpretation, my iconological interpretation, the real message of Botticelli in this painting, in my opinion, is the shape of classic. Some information about the painting. The painting of Calumny is a temperon panel executed between 1494 and 1497, after the passing of Lorenzo de' Medici. 1492, that is the beginning of the modern age, the discovery of America, the death of Lorenzo, and during the political crisis in Florence. Second, the artwork was inspired by the lost allegorical painting of Apelles of Kos. Apelles of Kos was the famous Greek artist, 4th century BC. The Calumny was described, furthermore, by the ancient Greek poet Lucian of Samosata. Lucian is a poet of the 2nd century AD, in the short treatise, How to Defend Yourself from Calumny, by Calumny. The work of Lucian was published in 1503 in Venice by the famous Renaissance printer Aldo Manuzio. It's very important, Aldo Manuzio in Venice, because he was the inventor of italic typeface and the pocket format book. And this is important for the culture of Botticelli. The second part of my speech is the iconographic description, a brief iconographic description, the unfair trial. On the right, it is necessary to read this painting from the right to left, because Lucian of Samosata said this in this book. King Midas is the judge, and King Midas is sitting on the throne and considering the decision, whilst two girls embodying suspicion and ignorance, embodying in the suspicion and ignorance, two girls whisper false words in his donkey ears. And King Midas has lowered eyes and is neglecting the scene in front of him, relying on his bad counselors. The judge turns his right arm to a man covered with a hood, and the man represents the prosecutor. In the center, an agitated group, such as a film. In the central part of the painting, the angry prosecutor personifies rage and squeezes the wrist of a female figure. This female figure is the center of the painting, and is Calumny. Calumny, in turn, drags the slandered one by the hair. And Calumny, it is the famous Nympha Fiorentina, beautiful girl. Calumny is depicted as a woman of extraordinary beauty, holding a burning torch in her left hand, whilst, with her right hand, she drags the naked, slandered man before the judge. Meanwhile, two girls, allegories of conspiracy and fraud, are adorning Calumny's hair with roses and white ribbon, images of purity and innocence. Of course, there is a tension of contraries. Finally, on the left, third part of the picture, an elderly woman with a black hood symbolizes repentance. Two hoods, note hood, the rage, hood, repentance, and averts her eyes from the scene. She turns to look at truth, naked and motionless. The figure of truth, naked, is not in movement. and the presence of truth outside of the trial concludes the description, but the main feature of the judgment is, of course, asks at the same time forgotten but necessary, this necessary presence, the truth and calumny. And let's move to the third part of my brief speech, my iconological interpretation. Iconological in the sense of Erwin Panofsky, the famous scholar about the iconology and about the difference between iconography and iconology. In my opinion, the message of Botticelli is the shape of classic. What is classic in Botticelli? Botticelli reinterprets Apelle's classical allegory, the lost allegorical paint of Apelles, lost. Botticelli doesn't watch the picture because it was lost, but this is an allegory of judgment through the lens of Renaissance humanism. Humanism emphasizing the dialectical tension, the contraries between injustice and truth. It's very important to read justice through injustice for Botticelli. King Midas, in fact, indeed, with donkey ears, symbol of the unjust judge, is in contrast to King Solomon. King Solomon is the icon of wisdom. In the background, the back office face is this. The icon of wisdom and the isolated and naked truth pointing to the heavens embodies a neglected yet essential presence in the judgment scene. What is classic in Botticelli? First of all, the classical Greece. The Calumny is a rendering of the lost allegorical painting of Apelles of Kos, 4th century BC, not a copy, an interpretation. Lucian of Samosata, 2nd century AD, How to Defend Himself from Calumny, describes the calumny of Apelles. But Botticelli follows this. And the calumny, second, is the outcome of a technique already used in ancient Greek, a famous technique. This technique named ekphrasis. In Greek is digression, ekphrasis. Digression to tell a visual experience with words. I use image to describe an experience, to describe a value. From image to words, from words to image. For example, for instance, Homer, 9th century BC, the classical Greece, description of the Achilles shield. In the Achilles shield, book 18th of Iliad, there is the shield of Achilles. In the shield, there is a sort of a strips. There is a monitor. In the monitor, we can see a scene of the ancient trial in the town of Peace. Secondly, the message of Botticelli is the shape of classic because Botticelli is modern. The calumny is after the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And the modern age is the Renaissance model of Leon Battista Alberti. Leon Battista Alberti wrote De Pictura, 1435. In De Pictura, Leon Battista Alberti, famous scholar of Italian language, imitation of classic poets. There is necessary imitation, mimesis, imitatio, ut pictura poesis in Latin, literature like painting, from words to image, from image, of course, to words. And Botticelli attended the Neoplatonic Academy of Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino was a Neoplatonic, and of course, Botticelli learned the dialectic philosophy. For Plato, philosophy is dialectic. And dialectic is the cultural foundation of humanities intended in the human-centered design. The project, the design of Renaissance is this. And let's move to the final part of this. In my opinion, there are two messages of Botticelli. The first is the dialectical justice by figures of speech. Botticelli used figures of speech, and the scene critiques the denial of the adversarial system, a cornerstone, of course, of the fair trial, the due process of law, and use antithesis, use injustice, the unfair trial, to teach what is the fair trial, what is justice. The judge, King Midas, is influenced by suspicion and ignorance that are allegories, other shape, other form of a figure of speech, figures of speech. And it violates impartiality by refusing opposing viewpoints. The calumny is a narration of opposing viewpoints. And the slandered figure, who is naked as truth. Truth and slandered man are naked. Why naked? Because he is denied right to defend by the calumny, the center of the painting, another allegory, and who is holding a burning torch, symbol of light of knowledge, metaphor. Three figures of speech, allegory, antithesis, metaphor. And this is a shape of classic, a way to understand the justice, the sense of justice. But Botticelli is also modern. What is modern Renaissance in Botticelli? In this link between justice, law, and art. Renaissance model of Leon Battista Alberti, imitation of classic poets, and Neoplatonic Academy. At the end of my speech, what is the classic model? The concept of classic is what is for always. And what is for always? A timeless model of justice, as taught by the Greek philosopher, as Plato, Aristotle, for example, that Botticelli knew well because attended the Neoplatonic Academy. What is truth? The original truth appears in the trial through its denial. Socrates said the truth can never be refuted. And it's important because it is important to avoid the oblivion of the naked truth, the famous nuda veritas in Latin, naked truth of the classical culture. And this is important in the judicial procedure, which is a fair and transparent comparison of opposing theses. Without opposition, there is no trial, there is no fair trial, there is no fairness. In conclusion, what is law? Why? I can understand law through art, through painting, through Botticelli, because the sources of law are not only positive norms, of course, are positive, but not only. Judicial decisions, yes, but not only. Not only legal opinions of doctrine, but above all, shared and permanent values of the dialectical truth, also safeguarded by the most elevated and ingenious forms of the artistic representation. Botticelli, in my opinion, was a jurist, not only an artist. And this is very important for the background of our culture, of our culture in law. But for more information, you can read my essay in the online collection of the Italian Society of Law and Literature. And thank you very much for your attention.